In this video, we're going to look at how React can connect with Redux. This is the application that we're going to build. The layout of the application closely resembles how our React components are structured. First, we'll look at adding state to a parent component, which will then trickle down through its descendants as well as its sibling. After that, we'll look at initiating state change within a descendant, which can affect its ancestors as well as its ancestors' siblings. Lastly, we'll look at how a sibling can also initiate state change, which in turn affects its sibling as well as its siblings' descendants. I think by doing this, we will learn some of the difficulties in managing state through multiple components of the React application, as well as passing properties. And we'll refactor incorporating Redux into our application, which will help in this process. Let's get the party started. Let's go ahead and create our new application. Okay, we can move into it now. All right, we should go ahead and install Redux. All right, let's start the application. Everything looks good. Okay, let's go ahead and open our code editor. In order to save time, I'm going to ask that you guys copy some styling from a gist that I'll make publicly available in the description of this video. Now we'll go ahead and paste in App.css. Okay, it seems like everything's working. We'll start the project off by working in App.js. Let's delete all the stuff we don't need. Now we can go ahead and render the components that we'll be creating. We haven't defined these components yet, so let's go ahead and do that. We define a functional component called counter. Inside of that, we render one div. This div has a class name of counter for styling, and inside of that, we have a heading called counter. This will help us to identify this component. We can do the same thing for sibling. Now we need to import these components into app.js for consumption. And it seems that everything's working okay. Excellent. Let's take a moment to think about our objectives. We want to create a counter component, which will allow the user to increment the count, as well as children components, which will pass the count as props for display. Okay, let's start in counter. So you can see that we have a div counter, which simply has some JSX in it. Right now we're hard coding on 1, as well as a button, which doesn't work for incrementing. Afterwards, we're running an icon nested within the counter's children. We haven't defined the child element yet, so let's go ahead and import it. Okay, you can see that the child component is yet again another functional component. Inside of this component, we render a grandchild. Once again, we haven't defined this yet, so let's go ahead and do that. The grandchild component is not different. We've got the class name that corresponds to the style. We've got a header. We've got an icon nested within, as well as a child component, great grandchild. This will be our last component. And here we go, our great grandchild component. We've hard coded a 1 in here, but we'll figure out how to make it work in just a few moments. Let's go ahead and use Font Awesome to grab ourselves the appropriate icons. We're going to import Font Awesome using a CDN. You can find it at this URL here. Now we can link to it. And here's what we've done so far. We've created a counter component, which has a sibling component. We can see that the counter component has a child, which in turn renders a grandchild, which in turn renders a great grandchild. Both counter and great grandchild care about the same piece of state, count. We've also added the buttons so that both of them can initiate a state change. Let's go ahead and work on counter. We'll add a callback to onClick where we console log go. And now we can see that our button is firing when clicked. Okay, the next thing we need to do is refactor counter so that it's a class-based component. On lines 6 through 9, we're giving it some initial state. On lines 11 through 16, we're implementing a method which will update the count as well as the background color when this function fires. Our render method is passed the state of background color as well as count on line 27 and 23. Lastly, we pass the callback to the onClick event listener on line 29. Now if we jump back to our browser, we can see that increment works. So now the question becomes, how can we get great-grandchild to update? The solution I'm going to present to you is called prop drilling. On line 38, we're going to pass the child component, the state of count, within counter. On line 5 of child, we grab the props object and pass it into its child, grandchild, on line 13. Grandchild behaves in the same way. We look at the props grandchild receives and pass the value count. The great-grandchild component is where we finally consume this count. On line 7, we render it to the screen. Now we'll see when we increment and counter that great-grandchild is also affected. Excellent. However, when we press increment in the great-grandchild, nothing happens. A solution to this would be to pass increment, defined in counter, to great-grandchild through its descendants. We'll pass child a property called increment counter, and the value of this property will be this.increment. On line 14 of child, we look at the properties that child has received and pass it as a property to grandchild. In grandchild, we do exactly the same thing. We look at the props of grandchild, increment counter, and we pass it to great-grandchild as increment counter. Once again, great-grandchild is where this property is consumed. We pass this function to the onClick event listener of the button of great-grandchild. Now we can see that we can increment and counter as well as great-grandchild. I bet you're probably wondering now how we can get the great-grandchild component to turn blue as well as the arrows to point up. The answer lies in initializing a new piece of state in counter. On line 8, we add a new piece of state called firing component. The value by default is counter. We also refactor increment. Increment takes an argument, firing component, and we use that to set state on line 13. On line 20, we use the ternary operator to determine our background color. On line 21, we use string concatenation as well as another ternary operator to determine which way the arrow should point. On line 31, we update our onClick event handler. When this function is fired, we pass an additional argument, counter. On line 37, we use the direction that we defined at the top of the render method. Lastly, we pass child an additional property, firing component, where the value is the state of firing component inside of counter. Inside of child, we use the property firing component passed to it from the counter component to form a string. This string direction is passed to line 11 to form our arrow's direction. In the grandchild component, we do the same thing. We form a string using the property sent in from child. We take that string direction and pass it on line 12. In great-grandchild, we're interested in this property on line 5. If the firing component is great-grandchild, then we'll highlight the background color of this component. Otherwise, we'll return null. On line 8, we update the increment counter function call. We pass it the argument great-grandchild. When we increment the counter, it stays blue and the arrows point down. When we increment the great-grandchild, it turns blue, the counter changes back to the default state, and the arrows point up. Let's recap what we've done so far. We defined some components which are nested within each other. Counter has many descendants. We've also passed properties where required in order to share data and behavior. Namely, this is count and the function onIncrement within the counter component. Lastly, we've driven component level state based on user behavior and app conditions. Specifically, the counter component, if the user incremented within that component, its background was blue. The same was true for the great-grandchild. What we haven't done yet is connect the state of the counter to the sibling. We'll do that in the next video easily using Redux.